After 5 years of dedicating everything to Reynolds Media Group, I was finally diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer. When I asked for 8 weeks of medical leave for treatment, my boss Mark Reynolds looked at me and said coldly, "We'll need to let you go." 3 years later, as I signed the papers making me the new owner of his failing company, the look on his face was worth every moment of pain I'd endured. The meeting where he begged for a position in his former company is one I'll never forget. I still remember the exact moment my world collapsed around me. The sterile office with its minimalist decor and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Seattle. The afternoon light was fading, casting long shadows across Mark's expensive mahogany desk as he leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. I had just finished explaining my diagnosis, my treatment plan, the timeline for my return, all carefully researched and organized in the folder that now sat untouched between us. "I've given everything to this company, Mark," I said, my voice steady despite the fear coursing through me. "The doctor says with proper treatment, I can beat this. I just need 8 weeks. His expression didn't change. There was no flicker of compassion, no hint of the mentor I thought I'd known for 5 years. Instead, he glanced down at his watch, the Rolex I knew his wife had given him for their anniversary, and sighed as if I'd asked him for an unreasonable favor, rather than a legally protected medical leave. "Sarah," he said, my name sounding foreign on his lips. "Reynolds Media Group is at a critical juncture. The Westfield acquisition is happening now. We can't afford to have our director of operations absent for 2 months." I felt my chest tighten, a strange counterpoint to the tumor growing inside me. "I've already created a transition plan," I replied, reaching for the folder he hadn't bothered to open. "Jessica can handle day-to-day operations. I've prepared detailed instructions for each phase of the acquisition, and I can be available remotely for consultation during my recovery days." Mark waved his hand dismissively, as if swatting away an annoying insect. "That's not the same as being here, and you know it." "I've never taken a sick day in 5 years, I reminded him, fighting to keep the desperation from my voice. "I've worked weekends, holidays. I led the team that landed the Ashcroft account when everyone said it was impossible." For a moment, I thought I saw something soften in his gaze, but it was gone so quickly I might have imagined it, replaced by the cool, calculating look I'd seen him use in difficult negotiations, never directed at me until now. "Sarah, business is business. We need someone in your position who can be fully present. We'll need to let you go." 5 words. 5 simple words that erased half a decade of sacrifice, dedication, and loyalty. 5 words that made it clear what I'd always been to Reynolds Media Group, not a valued team member but a replaceable component, useful only until I showed the first sign of weakness. I felt my stomach drop, but years of corporate training kept my face composed. The irony wasn't lost on me. The same professional poise Mark had once praised me for now concealed my devastation from him. I straightened my spine, ignored the dull ache starting in my chest, and nodded as if his decision made perfect sense. "I understand," I said, though I didn't. Not really. How could someone discard a person who had helped build their company from a mid-tier agency into one of Seattle's most sought-after marketing firms? How could someone who had invited me to his family's Thanksgiving dinner just months before now look at me with such cold indifference? "Human Resources will prepare your severance package," he continued, already reaching for his phone, already moving on. "You'll receive 2 months' salary, which should cover you until you're back on your feet." The calculated cruelty of his choice of words hit me like a physical blow. "Until you're back on your feet," as if my cancer treatment were a minor inconvenience rather than a fight for my life. "Of course," I replied, standing up smoothly, refusing to let my hands shake. "I'll clear out my office today." As I turned to leave, Mark called out, "Nothing personal, Sarah. I'm sure you understand." I paused at the door, my hand on the handle. For a brief moment, I considered telling him exactly what I thought of his leadership, his values, his humanity. Instead, I smiled, the same confident, professional smile I'd used in countless client meetings. "Perfectly," I said, and walked out with my head held high. Outside Mark's office, the hallway stretched before me like a gauntlet. 20 steps to my office, past colleagues who had no idea my world had just imploded. I walked with measured steps, nodding at the creative team as they hurried past with storyboards for our newest client. My face betrayed nothing. Not the burning behind my eyes, not the hollowness spreading through my chest, not the crushing weight of dual betrayals, my body's and my boss's. When I reached my office, I closed the door softly behind me. The space I'd occupied for 5 years felt suddenly foreign, as if it already belonged to someone else. My awards lined one wall, the Clio we'd won for the breakthrough campaign I'd spearheaded last year, the industry recognition for the rebrand that had doubled Reynolds Media Group's client roster. Meaningless now, apparently. I sank into my chair, allowing myself exactly 60 seconds of weakness. 1 minute to let the reality wash over me. I had cancer, and now I had no job. 1 minute to acknowledge the fear that threatened to paralyze me. When those 60 seconds expired, I straightened my shoulders and began to pack. Jessica knocked tentatively at my door 20 minutes later, confusion written across her face. "Sarah? Marketing just got an email saying all campaign approvals should come to Greg starting tomorrow. What's going on?" Greg, my assistant. Apparently, my replacement was already decided. "I'm leaving RMG," I said, the words feeling strange on my tongue. Jessica stepped inside, closing the door. "What? Why? Is this about the Tanner account? Because that wasn't your fault. Their budget was slashed before we even pitched." I considered lying, creating some fiction about a better opportunity, but Jessica deserved better. We'd worked side by side for 3 years. "I've been diagnosed with breast cancer," I said, the second time I'd spoken the words aloud today. I requested medical leave for treatment. Mark decided it would be better to let me go instead. Jessica's face cycled through emotions, shock, disbelief, anger. "He can't do that. That's illegal. It's discrimination. It's Mark," I interrupted gently. "We both know how this works. On paper, I'll be laid off due to restructuring priorities or some other corporate euphemism." "Fight it," Jessica insisted, her eyes flashing. "You've given everything to this company. You're the reason we landed half our major accounts." I shook my head, continuing to place personal items in a cardboard box I'd retrieved from the supply closet. "My focus needs to be on treatment now, not a legal battle." Jessica fell silent, watching me pack 5 years of my professional life into a single box. Finally, she asked, "What can I do?" "Survive," I said with a small smile. "Keep doing excellent work. And maybe water my plants occasionally?" She nodded, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I'll miss you. We all will." "I'll miss this place too," I admitted, surprising myself with the truth of it. Despite Mark's betrayal, I had loved this job, this team we'd built, the work we'd created together. As I finished packing, Human Resources sent a young intern I barely recognized to escort me out of the building. Standard procedure for terminated employees, but it stung nonetheless. Jennifer from HR met me at the elevator with paperwork and empty assurances about COBRA benefits and continuation of health insurance. We both knew it wouldn't be enough to cover cancer treatment. "Your personal items will be shipped to your home address," she recited mechanically. "Please surrender your keycard and parking pass." I handed them over, feeling strangely detached from the entire process. It was as if I were watching someone else go through the motions, someone else nodding calmly as 15 years of marketing experience was reduced to a checklist of surrendered company property. In the parking garage, I placed my single box in the trunk of my car and sat behind the wheel. The afternoon sun slanted through the windows, warming my face. For the first time since the doctor had said the word malignant, I allowed myself to cry, not the elegant, dignified tears of movies, but harsh, racking sobs that left me gasping for breath. I cried for the unfairness of it all, for the body that had betrayed me, for the career I'd built with such care only to see it dismantled in a moment. I cried until my throat was raw and my eyes burned, until the security guard started giving my car concerned glances. Then I did what I had always done when faced with adversity. I took a deep breath, wiped my eyes, and made a plan. Driving home. Through Seattle's late afternoon traffic, I considered my options. My savings would cover 3 months of expenses, maybe 4 if I was careful. My parents, retired and living on a fixed income in Arizona, couldn't help financially. I had no spouse to lean on. My last serious relationship had ended 2 years ago when Paul chose a promotion in Chicago over our future together. By the time I reached my apartment, I had decided on my first steps. File for unemployment, apply. For medical assistance programs, reach out to my network for job leads, and most importantly, fight the cancer growing inside me with every ounce of strength I possessed. What I didn't know then, couldn't have known, was that Mark Reynolds had just made the biggest mistake of his life. In his coldly calculated decision to discard me, at my most vulnerable, he had set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately lead to his downfall. But that revelation was still years away, waiting for me on the other side of the hardest battle I would ever face. My battle with cancer began 1 week after my termination from Reynolds Media Group. The oncology center at Seattle Memorial was a stark contrast to the sleek corporate environment I'd left behind. All soft colors and gentle voices, designed to soothe rather than impress. I sat in a comfortable chair as chemicals designed to kill the rapidly dividing cells in my body dripped into my veins, wondering how my life had changed so dramatically in such a short time. "First treatment's always the hardest," said Eleanor, the nurse who monitored my IV. Her kind eyes crinkled above her surgical mask, not knowing what to expect. I nodded, clutching the folder containing my treatment plan. I like to be prepared. "Cancer doesn't care much for plans," she replied with gentle honesty. "But having them helps anyway." She was right. Despite meticulous preparation, nothing could have readied me for what followed. The bone-deep fatigue that made even lifting my head from the pillow feel like an Olympic event. The nausea that arrived in waves, unpredictable and violent. The strange taste that coated my tongue, making even my favorite foods unrecognizable. The clumps of dark hair that came away in my hands until I finally took control and shaved my head one tearful evening. Through it all, I kept working, not at a traditional job, but at creating a new path forward. Between treatments, during the hours when the fog of medication lifted enough for clarity, I transformed my dining room into a command center. Spreadsheets tracked my medical expenses, insurance claims, and dwindling savings. Job applications filled my inbox, though I knew my chances were slim. Who would hire a marketing director undergoing aggressive cancer treatment? Instead, I turned to freelance consulting. My reputation in Seattle's marketing community was strong enough that several former clients reached out after hearing of my departure from RMG. I didn't share the circumstances of my leaving, professional pride perhaps, or simply not wanting pity to be the reason for their business. I worked from home, scheduling video calls during my better hours, delivering strategies and campaign ideas that didn't require my physical presence in an office. It wasn't nearly enough to cover my mounting medical bills, but it kept my mind engaged and my skills sharp. More importantly, it gave me purpose during the darkest days of treatment when my body seemed determined to surrender while my mind refused. Jessica visited weekly, bringing updates from RMG that she probably shouldn't have shared. Greg, my former assistant, was struggling in my role. The Westfield acquisition, the very project Mark couldn't afford to have me absent for, was faltering under inexperienced leadership. Clients were expressing concerns about the change in management. He asks about your old files at least 3 times a day, Jessica reported during one visit. Helping me change my bedsheets when standing for too long left me dizzy. He has no idea how you managed everything so efficiently. He'll figure it out, I said. Though privately I felt a small, petty satisfaction at the chaos my absence had created. Or Mark will replace him too. Mark's been in closed-door meetings all week, Jessica confided. Word is, Westfield's having second thoughts about the acquisition. Something about leadership instability. I absorbed this information without comment. The part of me that had poured my soul into building Reynolds Media Group's reputation felt a pang at the thought of its struggles. The part of me still raw from betrayal thought, good. 3 months into my treatment, an unexpected opportunity arose. Michael Chen, a former client who had left his corporate position to start his own investment firm, contacted me about a potential project. I need someone who understands brand development from the ground up, he explained during our video call, tactfully not mentioning my gaunt face or the colorful scarf wrapped around my bare head. Someone who can identify undervalued companies with strong potential. It's a short-term consulting role, but it could lead to something more permanent when the timing is right. I recognized his careful avoidance of my health situation and appreciated it. Tell me more. Michael explained that his firm was looking to invest in struggling but fundamentally sound businesses in the Pacific Northwest. My role would be to evaluate their market positioning, identify weaknesses in their branding and marketing strategies, and assess their potential for growth with proper guidance. Essentially, I need someone who can spot diamonds in the rough. He concluded, your name was the first that came to mind. The irony wasn't lost on me, being asked to find value in struggling companies while I myself was fighting to rebuild my own life. But the project intrigued me, offering a new direction that would leverage my skills while accommodating my limited physical capacity. I'm interested, I told him. But I should be transparent. I'm still undergoing treatment. There will be days I can't work. Michael nodded. I know about your diagnosis, Sarah. This position is flexible by design. Work when you can, rest when you need to. The quality of your insights matters more than your hours. For the first time, since my diagnosis, I felt a spark of something beyond determination, something that might have been hope. When do we start? That conversation marked a turning point, though I couldn't have known it then. As my body fought its internal battle, my mind engaged with a new challenge, one that would eventually lead me back to Mark Reynolds in circumstances neither of us could have imagined. Over the next several months, while undergoing chemotherapy, radiation, and finally surgery, I reviewed dozens of companies for Michael's firm. I worked from hospital beds and treatment rooms, analyzing market reports and brand positioning statements while nurses monitored my vital signs. The work became a refuge, a place where cancer couldn't reach, where I was still valued for my expertise, rather than defined by my illness. One particular company caught my attention during my work for Michael's investment firm, Clearview Digital, a mid-sized regional marketing agency that had been losing ground to larger competitors despite an impressive client history and solid creative work. As I dug deeper into their financial statements and client roster, patterns emerged that sparked my professional curiosity. Their fundamentals are strong, I explained to Michael during one of our weekly review sessions, this one taking place in my apartment as I recovered from my most recent surgery. They've maintained relationships with key clients for over 7 years. That's practically a lifetime in this industry. Their creative work consistently wins regional awards. So why are they struggling? Michael asked, making notes on his tablet. I pointed to my analysis on the screen between us. Leadership vacuum. The founder retired 2 years ago, and the new management team has been playing it safe, maintaining existing accounts but not pursuing growth. They're coasting on past success. Michael nodded thoughtfully. Fixable? With the right direction? Absolutely. They need someone who understands both the creative and business sides, who can modernize their approach while honoring their strengths. I hesitated, then added, "Someone like me." The words surprised both of us. Michael raised an eyebrow, but didn't immediately dismiss the idea. "You're thinking beyond consulting?" I hadn't been, not consciously. But now that the thought had surfaced, it took hold with unexpected force. Their client base doesn't overlap significantly with Reynolds Media Group. Their team is solid but underutilized. With proper leadership and strategic repositioning, they could capture the mid-market segment RMG has been neglecting while focusing on bigger fish. Michael studied me with new interest. "You've thought about this." "I'm thinking about it now," I admitted. "What if instead of just identifying these opportunities for others, I pursued one myself?" That conversation planted a seed that grew stronger as my health gradually improved. 6 months after my diagnosis, my oncologist delivered cautiously optimistic news. The treatment was working. I wasn't cancer-free, but the prognosis was good. For the first time, I allowed myself to think beyond survival to rebuilding. During my recovery, I'd kept tabs on Reynolds Media Group through industry news and occasional updates from Jessica, who had eventually left for a position at a larger agency. The Westfield acquisition had ultimately fallen through, and rumors circulated about financial difficulties. Mark had cycled through 3 different operations directors since my departure, none lasting more than a few months. I felt no satisfaction in RMG's struggles. Well, perhaps a small private vindication, but I was more focused on my own path. Forward. The idea of revitalizing Clearview Digital had evolved from idle thought to concrete plan. I arranged a meeting with Michael to discuss something beyond consulting. "You want to run Clearview?" Michael clarified when I presented my proposal, his expression a mix of surprise and intrigue. "I want us to acquire it," I corrected. "With me at the helm. I've developed a comprehensive turnaround strategy." I handed him a folder containing my analysis. Clearview has valuable assets, loyal clients, talented creatives, solid industry reputation. What they lack is vision and modern leadership. I can provide both. Michael flipped through my proposal, his expression growing more interested with each page. "This is extremely detailed." "I've had a lot of time to think between treatments," I said dryly. He looked up, meeting my eyes. "Sarah, this is compelling, but acquiring and turning around a company requires significant capital. Even with investment backing, I'm putting in my own money," I interrupted. "Everything I have, my savings, my 401k, even the equity in my condo. I believe in this opportunity." Michael's expression shifted from professional interest to concern. "That's a substantial personal risk, especially after what you've been through." I nodded, acknowledging the truth in his words. "Cancer taught me something, Michael. Nothing is guaranteed. Not health, not careers, not loyalty from people you've given years to. The only real security comes from creating something that's truly yours." He considered this, then asked, "And if my firm provides the additional capital needed, what's the projected timeline for turnaround?" 18 months to profitability, I said without hesitation. 3 years to significant market growth. 5 years to position for either expansion or attractive acquisition offers. Ambitious. Realistic, I countered. I know this market. I know what Clearview is capable of with proper direction. Michael tapped his fingers on my proposal, his expression thoughtful. "Our firm typically looks for passive investments, not active management positions." "This isn't typical," I acknowledged, "but neither am I." After a long moment, he smiled. "No, you certainly aren't. Let me take this to my partners. We'll need to do our own due diligence, of course." Of course. 2 weeks later, Michael's firm agreed to back my acquisition of Clearview Digital, with conditions. I would invest my personal capital as proposed, maintain majority ownership to ensure my commitment, and meet quarterly performance benchmarks. In return, they would provide the additional funding needed to complete the purchase and support initial operational changes. The negotiations with Clearview's owners were surprisingly straightforward. They had been seeking an exit strategy, tired of managing a business they had inherited rather than built. When presented with a fair offer and assurances about retaining their existing team, they readily agreed. 3 months later, almost exactly 1 year after Mark Reynolds had coldly dismissed me from his office, I walked into Clearview Digital as its new CEO and majority owner. The small team of 23 employees gathered in the main conference room looked apprehensive, uncertain what changes this ownership transition would bring. Many of you are wondering who I am and what my plans are for Clearview, I began, looking around the room at my new colleagues. Let me be clear. I'm here because I believe in what this agency can become. You have talent, you have loyal clients, and now you have leadership that will fight for your success with everything I have, because your success is now my success too. My first 6 months at the helm of Clearview Digital were a masterclass in controlled transformation. I didn't sweep in with dramatic changes and new management philosophies. That kind of upheaval rarely succeeds in creative industries where talent is your primary asset. Instead, I spent those initial weeks listening and observing, conducting one-on-one meetings with every team member from senior designers to administrative staff. I need to understand what's working before I can address what isn't, I explained, during those conversations. Most employees seemed cautiously optimistic, though a few senior team members remained skeptical of my intentions. Nathan, the creative director who had been with Clearview since its founding, summed up the prevailing sentiment during our first meeting. We've seen 3 leadership changes in 2 years. Each new person promises revolution, then either changes nothing, meaningful, or tries to transform us into something we're not. I'm not interested in revolution, I told him. I'm interested in evolution. Clearview has good bones. We don't need to demolish the structure. We need to renovate and build upon it. My assessment confirmed what I had suspected during my initial analysis. Clearview's fundamental issue wasn't talent or client relationships, but strategic direction. The agency had been reactive rather than proactive, accepting whatever projects came their way instead of deliberately shaping their portfolio and market position. My first significant change came after 3 months of observation, a reorganization, of teams to create specialized units focused on different industry sectors rather than general service categories. Each unit combined account managers, strategists, and creatives who would develop deep expertise in specific industries: healthcare, finance, technology, and consumer products. Clients don't just want marketing services anymore, I explained during the all-hands meeting where I announced the change. They want partners who understand their industry challenges, regulations, and opportunities. By developing specialized knowledge, we can provide insights that generalist agencies can't match. The restructuring wasn't without growing pains. Some team members resisted moving from projects they enjoyed to unfamiliar territory. Others worried about being pigeonholed into sectors they found less creatively stimulating. Change is uncomfortable, I acknowledged during a particularly tense team meeting when concerns bubbled to the surface. I've experienced that personally and professionally, but comfort rarely leads to growth. I shared something I rarely discussed: my cancer journey and Reynolds Media Group's response to it. Not as a bid for sympathy, but to illustrate how unexpected disruption can ultimately lead to better outcomes. A year ago, I thought losing my position at RMG was the worst thing that could happen to my career, I told them. Today, I'm grateful for it. It forced me to reevaluate everything and ultimately led me here, to building something I truly believe in. The personal disclosure seemed to shift something in the team's perspective. Perhaps seeing my vulnerability made my leadership more accessible, or maybe it simply contextualized the changes I was implementing against the backdrop of more significant life challenges. Whatever the reason, resistance began to soften as we moved forward. By month 4, we had secured 2 new clients specifically because of our industry specialization approach. By month 6, we had retained all existing clients and added 5 new ones, increasing revenue by 22% compared to the previous year's same period. The financial improvements allowed me to implement the second phase of my strategy, investing in our people. I introduced comprehensive health benefits that exceeded industry standards, a decision directly influenced by my own experience navigating medical care with inadequate insurance. I established professional development budgets for each employee and initiated a profit-sharing program that would activate once we reached specific financial targets. "Why are you doing this?" asked Melanie, our operations manager, after I presented the new benefits package. "Most new owners come in looking to cut costs, not increase them." "Because talent is our only real asset," I replied simply. "Everything else, our office, our computers, our client list, is replaceable. But people with creativity, expertise, and passion, they're irreplaceable, and I never want anyone at Clearview to feel disposable." There was an unspoken understanding in her eyes, a recognition that my words carried the weight of personal experience. The most challenging aspect of those early months wasn't the business strategy or financial management, but my own health. Though my cancer was in remission, the after-effects of treatment lingered. Fatigue could still overwhelm me without warning. My immune system remained compromised, turning simple colds into week-long ordeals. Monthly checkups with my oncologist were constant reminders of the sword that still hung over my head. I worked around these limitations rather than fighting them, scheduling my most demanding meetings during my peak energy hours, building recovery, time into my calendar after travel, being transparent with my leadership team about days when I needed to work remotely. This openness about my own limitations set a tone throughout the company. We acknowledged human realities rather than perpetuating the harmful myth of the indestructible executive. 8 months into my tenure at Clearview, during a quarterly review with Michael's investment firm, he made an observation that caught me by surprise. "You're not just turning Clearview around," he said, reviewing our financial reports. "You're creating something entirely new while preserving what worked before. It's not just good business, it's good leadership." I hadn't thought of it in those terms. I'd been focused on practical steps, measurable outcomes, the daily work of rebuilding a company. But Michael was right. I was creating the kind of company I wished had existed when I needed support most, one that valued both results and humanity. What I didn't realize then was that this transformation was happening just in time for an unexpected confrontation with my past. Around the 18-month mark of my leadership at Clearview, our transformation was gaining industry recognition. We'd doubled our client roster, increased revenue by 47%, and established ourselves as specialists in sectors our competitors were struggling to penetrate. Our healthcare division, in particular, had become known for campaigns that balanced regulatory compliance with genuine emotional connection, a combination that larger agencies often failed to achieve. Was reviewing applications for 3 new design positions we'd opened when Nathan knocked on my office door, his expression unusually hesitant. "Got a minute?" he asked, lingering at the threshold. "Of course." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. Nathan had evolved from skeptic to ally over the past year, his creative vision flourishing within our new structure. His reluctance now was unusual. He sat, fidgeting with the tablet in his hands. "We've been approached about a potential new client. Major opportunity, 6-figure initial contract with options to expand, full rebrand plus ongoing campaign management. That sounds promising. Why do I sense a but coming?" Nathan grimaced. "The client is Westfield Properties." The name hung in the air between us. Westfield, the acquisition that Mark Reynolds couldn't afford to have me absent for during cancer treatment. The deal that had allegedly fallen through after my departure. "I see," I said carefully, keeping my expression neutral. "And how did they find us?" Their CMO attended the healthcare marketing conference where we presented last month. Apparently, our work for Memorial Health System impressed him. Nathan paused. There's more. They were previously working with Reynolds Media Group, but have been unhappy with recent results. They're looking to make a change. A complex emotion rose within me. Not quite satisfaction, not quite vindication, but something adjacent to both. I kept my voice even. Have they specified what they're looking for? A fresh approach to their new residential development downtown. They want to position it as a wellness-focused living community. He hesitated. There's one other thing. Their point of contact for the project would be Greg Harmon, my former assistant, the man who had replaced me at RMG. Interesting, I said, though interesting hardly captured the swirl of feelings this information evoked. Nathan watched me carefully. Should I tell them we're not interested? Given your history, the question gave me pause. 18 months. Ago, I might have jumped at the chance for this kind of poetic justice, stealing a major client from the company that had discarded me at my most vulnerable. But I'd worked too hard building Clearview's reputation for integrity to risk it on personal vendettas. No, I decided. If they're genuinely interested in our approach and we believe we can deliver exceptional work for them, we should pursue it. This needs to be a business decision, not a personal one. Nathan nodded, visibly relieved. I'll set up the initial meeting. Their team wants to visit our office next week. After he left, I sat alone with thoughts of what this development might mean. I hadn't actively followed Reynolds Media Group's trajectory since focusing on Clearview, though industry gossip occasionally reached me. I knew they'd lost several major accounts over the past year. The creative leadership had changed twice, but I hadn't heard Mark Reynolds' name specifically mentioned in these updates. The potential Westfield account occupied my thoughts throughout the week. I reviewed our portfolio with extra scrutiny, ensured our pitch materials reflected our very best work, and prepared our team for the presentation with particular care. If Westfield was coming to us after working with RMG, they would have specific expectations and concerns we needed to address. When the day of the meeting arrived, I deliberately scheduled it in our largest conference room, the one we'd recently renovated to showcase large-format displays of our most successful campaigns. I wanted Westfield representatives to be immersed in our work before we even began our formal presentation. I was reviewing my notes one final time when Melanie appeared at my office door. "They're here," she announced. "3 people from Westfield and—" She hesitated. "And?" I prompted. "Greg Harmon from Reynolds Media Group is with them. Should I show them in?" So Mark was sending Greg as RMG's representative to try salvaging the relationship. It made a certain sense. Greg had been my assistant, might know my approach well enough to counter it. What Mark couldn't have known was how thoroughly I'd evolved beyond the strategies I'd employed at RMG. "Yes, please show them in, and ask Nathan and Sophia to join us." I stood behind my desk, smoothing down my blazer and taking a centering breath. This meeting was no longer just about winning a new client. It was my first direct contact with anyone from Reynolds Media Group since my dismissal. Professional as I intended to be, I couldn't deny the emotional undercurrent. The Westfield team entered first, their CMO, Daniel Chen, leading 2 colleagues whose names I'd memorized from the briefing materials. They shook my hand with genuine interest, making polite comments about our office space. Then came Greg Harmon, looking considerably more worn than when I'd last seen him. The confident assistant who had been poised to step into my role now appeared haggard, with dark circles under his eyes and a nervous energy to his movements. He faltered visibly when he saw me. "Sarah?" he said, his voice a mixture of surprise and what might have been guilt. I didn't realize you were the CEO here." I extended my hand, my smile professional and composed. "Greg, it's been a while. Welcome to Clearview Digital." His handshake was limp, his gaze unable to meet mine directly. Whatever he had expected from this meeting, facing me across the negotiating table clearly hadn't been it. Daniel Chen looked between us with sudden understanding. "You two know each other?" "We worked together at Reynolds Media Group," I explained smoothly. "Greg was my assistant before I left to pursue other opportunities." The careful phrasing hung in the air. Greg's expression confirmed he remembered the reality of my departure all too well. "Small industry," Daniel commented, seemingly oblivious to the tension. "That's excellent. You'll be familiar with Westfield's needs then, since Reynolds has been handling our account." "Actually," I replied, gesturing everyone toward the conference room, "I think you'll find our approach quite different from RMG's. We believe in tailored strategies rather than templated solutions, especially for projects as unique as your wellness-focused development." As we settled around the conference table, I caught Greg texting frantically under the table. I didn't need to see the screen to guess who might be receiving his urgent messages. Our presentation to the Westfield team proceeded with clockwork precision. Nathan walked them through our creative approach while Sophia detailed our strategic methodology. I observed Greg's discomfort grow as the Westfield executives responded with increasing enthusiasm to each element of our proposal. When Daniel Chen asked about our specialized healthcare team's ability to authenticate wellness messaging, Greg attempted to interject. "Reynolds Media Group also has healthcare expertise," he said, his voice lacking conviction even to my ears. "We've recently brought on consultants aren't the same as dedicated in-house specialists," I interjected smoothly. "Our healthcare team lives and breathes this sector. They understand not just marketing principles, but the evolving conversation around wellness and what today's consumers are actually seeking." Daniel nodded appreciatively. "That's exactly what's been missing in our current approach. The campaigns feel generic, like wellness terms were simply dropped into standard real estate marketing." Greg's phone buzzed repeatedly throughout our 2-hour meeting, each notification causing him to flinch slightly. By the time we concluded with a virtual tour of a similar project we'd completed for a boutique apartment development, the Westfield team was visibly impressed, and Greg looked positively ill. "This has been enlightening," Daniel said as we wrapped up. "You've given us a lot to consider. Would your team be available for a follow-up next week? We'd like to discuss budget specifics and timelines." "Absolutely," I replied. "Melanie can coordinate the details." As the Westfield executives gathered their materials, Greg pulled me aside, his expression strained. "Sarah, can we talk privately for a moment?" I nodded, leading him to my office while Nathan escorted the Westfield team out. Once the door closed behind us, Greg's professional facade crumbled. "You could have told me you were CEO here before." "Blindsiding me in front of a client," he said, accusation edging his voice. I raised an eyebrow. "Would you have told Mark if I had?" His silence was answer enough. "I thought not," I continued. "This isn't personal, Greg. Westfield approached us because they're dissatisfied with RMG's work. That's business. Mark is going to—" He trailed off, running a hand through his hair. "Going to what?" I prompted. Greg slumped into a chair. "Things haven't been great at Reynolds since you left," he admitted. "The Westfield account is one of our biggest remaining clients. If we lose them—" He shook his head. "Mark's been difficult. The pressure is intense." I felt an unexpected wave of empathy for Greg. He had been ambitious, certainly, but also a pawn in Mark's game. "That sounds challenging," I said neutrally. "I never wanted it to happen like that." He blurted suddenly, "Your termination." "I didn't. No, Mark was going to let you go when you requested medical leave. He told me afterward that it was a mutual decision, that you wanted to focus on your health without work obligations." I stared at him incredulously. "And you believed that?" "At first, yes." Greg wouldn't meet my eyes. "Then Jessica told me what really happened before she left. By then, I was drowning in your former responsibilities, trying to salvage client relationships I wasn't prepared to manage." Why are you telling me this now? He finally looked up, exhaustion evident in every line of his face. Because you deserve to know that what Mark did wasn't supported by the rest of the team. And because... He hesitated. Because I'm going to have to tell him that we're probably losing Westfield to you, and I wanted you to understand what that means. RMG is already struggling. This could be the tipping point. His candor was unexpected, and I found myself momentarily at a loss for words. Part of me, a small, vindictive part I wasn't particularly proud of, felt satisfaction knowing Mark Reynolds was facing consequences for his actions. But the larger part recognized that RMG employed dozens of people who had nothing to do with my dismissal. I appreciate your honesty, I said finally. But Westfield hasn't made their decision yet. If RMG wants to retain them, perhaps this is an opportunity to reassess your approach to their account. Greg let out a humorless laugh. Mark doesn't reassess, he doubles down. He'll blame me for today's meeting, insist we offer Westfield a discount to stay, further stretching resources we barely have. He stood, straightening his jacket with a gesture that seemed automatic rather than purposeful. Anyway, I should go. Mark's been texting nonstop. As he reached the door, he paused. For what it's worth, I'm glad you're doing well. The cancer? In remission, I said. Regular checkups, but the prognosis is good. He nodded, genuine relief, crossing his features. That's good. That's really good. Then, with a wry smile that held no humor, Clearview suits you. It's what RMG could have been if Mark had valued the right things. After Greg left, I sat alone in my office, turning over our conversation in my mind. His revelations weren't entirely surprising. I had suspected Mark might have misrepresented my departure, but hearing it confirmed stirred complicated emotions. Not rage exactly, but a simmering indignation that had never fully dissipated despite my successful rebirth at Clearview. My phone buzzed with a text from Nathan. Westfield team practically floating out of here. Daniel asked how quickly we could start if they decide to move forward. Good news, professionally speaking. Yet Greg's visibly defeated demeanor and his comments about RMG's precarious state lingered in my thoughts. I had built Clearview into exactly the kind of company I'd wanted, one that valued both results and humanity. Celebrating a competitor's downfall, even one who had treated me callously, didn't align with the principles I now championed. I was still contemplating this contradiction when Michael called. I just heard you met with Westfield, he said without preamble. Word travels fast in this industry. News to me is apparently news to everyone, I replied, unable to keep the irony from my voice. Yes, they came in today, promising initial discussion. That's not all I heard, Michael continued. There's talk that Reynolds Media Group is in serious financial trouble. Losing Westfield could be catastrophic for them. So, I've been told. Michael was quiet for a moment. You know, if RMG continues this downward trajectory, they could become an acquisition target. Their client list still has value, despite recent losses. I sat up straighter, suddenly alert to what Michael wasn't explicitly saying. You're not suggesting... I'm not suggesting anything, he said innocently. Just noting that our investment in Clearview has exceeded expectations. The board has approved additional capital for strategic growth opportunities. Acquiring a struggling competitor with complementary clients could be efficient expansion. The implication hung in the air between us. Acquiring Reynolds Media Group, the company that had discarded me when I needed support most, was theoretically possible. The thought was so wildly beyond anything I had imagined that I almost laughed. That's an interesting perspective, I managed. Just something to consider, Michael replied casually, particularly if winning the Westfield account accelerates their decline. Sometimes the most satisfying victory isn't defeating an opponent, but absorbing their strengths into your own organization. After we hung up, I stood at my office window, watching Seattle's skyline as afternoon shadows lengthened across the buildings. From my vantage point, I could just make out the gleaming glass tower where Reynolds Media Group occupied 3 floors, the same building where I had received my termination notice 2 years earlier. The idea Michael had planted took root despite my initial resistance. Acquiring RMG wouldn't be about revenge. It would be a sound business decision that could accelerate Clearview's growth by years. Their remaining client relationships, their industry contacts, their creative assets, all could be integrated into our operation with the right approach. And if such an acquisition meant Mark Reynolds would ultimately answer to me, well, that would be a consequence of business, not its primary purpose. The Westfield account decision came swiftly, far more quickly than is typical in our industry, where contract negotiations often drag for months. Just 1 week after our presentation, Daniel Chen called to inform me they were terminating their relationship with Reynolds Media Group and signing with Clearview Digital. Their legal team would be sending over the contracts that afternoon. Your approach simply aligned better with our vision, Daniel explained. And frankly, we've been frustrated with Reynolds for months. Their work has become formulaic, and their account management is chaotic. Different person every few weeks, constantly changing strategies. I maintained professional composure during our call, focusing on next steps and transition timelines rather than dwelling on what this meant for RMG. After hanging up, I shared the news with my leadership team, who celebrated appropriately. Landing a client of Westfield's caliber was legitimately worth celebrating, regardless of where they had come from. Later that evening, as I reviewed the contract details in my office, Nathan appeared in my doorway with an unusually serious expression. "You might want to see this," he said, placing his tablet on my desk. On the screen was an industry newsletter with the headline, "Reynolds Media Group announces layoffs amid client losses." The article detailed how RMG had let go 25 employees, nearly 30% of their workforce, following the loss of several major accounts. Mark Reynolds was quoted saying the restructuring was a strategic realignment to focus on core strengths and prepare for the next phase of growth, standard corporate language that masked the reality of a company in crisis. That was fast. I murmured, scanning the article. Nathan nodded. Industry insiders are saying Westfield was the tipping point. They were already operating on thin margins after losing the Amberson Hotel's account last quarter. I handed the tablet back to Nathan, unsure how to feel. Professional success intertwined with knowledge of others' suffering created an uncomfortable dissonance. Those 25 employees likely included people I had worked alongside for years, people who had families and mortgages and plans for futures now thrown into uncertainty. "We're hiring," I said after a moment. "If any of RMG's laid off, talent reaches out, I want their applications fast-tracked for consideration. Not guaranteed positions, but guaranteed interviews at minimum." Nathan looked surprised. "Even after how they treated you?" "The company isn't the same as its leadership," I replied. "Most of those people had nothing to do with Mark's decisions. They're collateral damage. This wasn't entirely altruistic. RMG had good people, creative directors, account managers, strategists who knew the industry inside out. Bringing the best of them into Clearview would strengthen our team while further weakening a competitor. But there was also a principle at stake. I had built Clearview to be better than RMG, not just in profitability, but in how we treated people. Over the next 2 weeks, applications from former RMG employees flooded in. I didn't participate directly in the interviews. That would have been uncomfortable for everyone involved, but I reviewed each hire before final approval. By month's end, we had brought on 7 former RMG staff members, each filling a role we had already planned to create as part of our expansion strategy. Among them was Patricia Winters, RMG's former finance director, who had been with the company even longer than I had. During her second interview, she requested to speak with me personally, an unusual request in our hiring process, but one I granted out of respect for her reputation. "I appreciate you considering my application," she began when we met in my office, "especially given the circumstances of your departure from Reynolds." I gestured for her to continue, curious about her purpose in seeking this conversation. Patricia straightened in her chair. "I want to be transparent. Things at Reynolds C have been deteriorating for over a year, but the pace has accelerated dramatically since losing Westfield. Mark has become erratic, making promises to clients we can't fulfill, approving campaigns without proper budgeting, blaming staff for failures that stem from his own decisions." "That sounds challenging," I said carefully. "It's worse than challenging. It's unsustainable," she replied bluntly. "Which is why I need to know, are you considering acquiring Reynolds Media Group?" The directness of her question caught me off guard. While Michael and I had discussed the possibility theoretically, we hadn't taken concrete steps, nor had we shared these discussions beyond a very small circle. "What makes you ask that?" I countered. Patricia's expression remained professional, but her eyes reflected the weariness of someone who had watched something valuable crumble through mismanagement. "Because all the signs are there. The strategic hires you're making from RMG's former staff, the clients you're pursuing, the sectors you're expanding into. You're methodically positioning Clearview to absorb Reynolds' business." Her assessment wasn't wrong, though the deliberateness she ascribed to my actions overstated the case. Still, her insight suggested a valuable perspective on RMG's internal situation, one that could prove useful if acquisition became a serious consideration. "We're exploring various growth strategies," I acknowledged, neither confirming nor denying her speculation. "Why does this matter to you particularly?" Patricia leaned forward slightly. "Because I spent 15 years helping build Reynolds before Mark drove it into the ground. Because I believe in what that company could be with proper leadership. And because I have information that would be relevant if acquisition is on the table." Now she had my full attention. "What kind of information?" "Financial vulnerabilities that aren't visible in their public reporting. Client contracts with unusual clauses that could present opportunities, and," she hesitated briefly, "evidence that Mark has been engaging in accounting practices that, while not necessarily illegal, border on misrepresentation to shareholders." The implication was clear. Patricia possessed insider knowledge that could significantly strengthen my position if I decided to pursue an acquisition of RMG. Her willingness to share this information represented both an ethical dilemma and a potential strategic advantage. "Why would you share this?" I asked directly. "Loyalty to RMG should theoretically extend beyond your employment there." Patricia's composed expression cracked slightly, revealing a flash of genuine emotion. "My loyalty was to what Reynolds Media Group stood for: creative excellence, client partnerships, valuing its people. Mark betrayed those principles long ago." She paused, collecting herself. "When you were forced out during your cancer treatment, 5 of us in senior leadership confronted him. We argued it was not only morally wrong, but legally questionable, and strategically short-sighted. He dismissed our concerns entirely. This was news to me. I had assumed my dismissal had been met with quiet acceptance throughout the company. The knowledge that some had actually advocated for me in my absence was unexpectedly affecting." "I didn't know that," I said quietly. "He wouldn't have wanted you to know," Patricia replied. "It didn't fit his narrative that business decisions should be made without sentiment or consideration of human factors." She straightened, professional demeanor reasserting itself. "So yes, I have information. And yes, I would share it if it meant Reynolds could be salvaged under leadership that understands business success and human decency aren't mutually exclusive." Our conversation continued for another 30 minutes, with Patricia providing just enough specific details about RMG's situation to confirm her knowledge without breaching confidentiality obligations that might still bind her legally. By the time she left my office, two things were clear. Reynolds Media Group was in far worse shape than industry gossip suggested, and an acquisition was potentially much more feasible than I had initially believed. That evening, I called Michael to arrange an urgent meeting with his investment team. As I laid out the new information, carefully anonymized to protect Patricia's identity, their initial skepticism about acquiring a struggling competitor evolved into cautious interest. If these financial assessments are accurate, Michael's senior analyst noted, reviewing the projections I'd prepared, RMG could be acquired for approximately 40% of its valuation from just 2 years ago, and their remaining client contracts would integrate seamlessly with our existing portfolio, I added. No significant overlap, complementary sectors. Michael, who had remained thoughtfully silent throughout most of the presentation, finally spoke. The business case is becoming compelling, but let's address the elephant in the room. Sarah, this is the company that fired you when you were diagnosed with cancer. Pursuing them as an acquisition target inevitably appears personal, regardless of the business logic. I nodded, acknowledging the perception. I've considered that. I won't pretend there isn't a certain symmetry to the situation that I find meaningful. But my primary motivation is Clearview's growth. RMG has valuable assets that are being squandered under current management. We can preserve what works, integrate it with our superior operational approach, and create something stronger than either company could be separately. Michael studied me carefully. And if the board insists on retention plans that would keep Mark Reynolds in some capacity during a transition period? The question struck at the heart of my private reservations. Could I work with Mark, even temporarily, after what had happened? The professional answer was yes, of course. Adults in business settings manage difficult interpersonal dynamics constantly. The honest answer was more complicated. If retention of current leadership is necessary to secure the deal's value, I said carefully, I would accept temporary arrangements with appropriate governance structures, but any long-term plan would need to establish clear authority lines, with Clearview's leadership model taking precedence. In other words, I would work with Mark only if he ultimately reported to me, a reversal that would indeed carry personal significance despite my attempts to frame this as purely business. Michael seemed satisfied with my response. Draft a formal acquisition proposal. We'll review it with the full investment committee next week. As I left the meeting, my phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. Need to speak with you urgently regarding RMG situation. Greg Harmon. Greg's timing was uncanny, almost as if he had sensed the conversation I'd just concluded. I hesitated before responding, weighing the potential value of his information against the complications his involvement might create. Finally, I texted back, available tomorrow morning, 8:00 a.m., Westlake Coffee on 5th, come alone. Whatever Greg wanted to discuss, it seemed the universe was determined to accelerate my collision course with Reynolds Media Group's future. I arrived at Westlake Coffee 30 minutes early, selecting a corner table with a clear view of both entrances. The morning rush had already peaked, leaving the cafe populated mainly by remote workers hunched over laptops and a few business people conducting informal meetings over espresso. I ordered green tea, still avoiding coffee since chemotherapy, had permanently altered my taste for it, and reviewed my notes while waiting. Greg arrived precisely at 8, looking even more haggard than during our last encounter. The dark circles under his eyes had deepened, and his normally impeccable appearance showed subtle signs of neglect. A slightly wrinkled shirt collar, hair not quite perfectly combed. He scanned the cafe anxiously before spotting me, then approached, with the cautious demeanor of someone walking into territory they're not entirely sure is safe. Thank you for meeting me, he said, sliding into the chair across from mine. I wasn't sure you would. Professional courtesy? I replied neutrally, though I'm curious why the secrecy. Greg glanced around before leaning forward. Mark doesn't know I'm here. No one at Reynolds does. If they found out I was meeting with you, He didn't complete the sentence, but his expression conveyed the implied consequence clearly enough. "I understand discretion," I assured him. "What's this about, Greg?" He took a deep breath. "Reynolds Media Group is imploding. The layoffs you've probably heard about were just the beginning. We've lost 3 more clients since Westfield left, smaller accounts, but the cumulative impact is devastating. Mark is liquidating the company's investment portfolio to cover operational expenses. We're behind on payments to vendors. It's a slow-motion collapse. None of this was particularly surprising given Patricia's revelations, but Greg's obvious distress lent an emotional weight to the clinical financial details I'd been reviewing. These weren't just numbers on spreadsheets. They represented real people watching their professional world disintegrate. "I'm sorry to hear that," I said, meaning it. "But I'm still not clear on why you're telling me this." Greg clasped his hands tightly on the table. "There are rumors. Industry whispers that Clearview might be positioning for an acquisition." His eyes met mine directly for the first time since he'd sat down. "Is it true?" I maintained a neutral expression, neither confirming nor denying. "Rumors often circulate in our industry, especially when companies are perceived as vulnerable." "Sarah, please," he said, a note of desperation entering his voice. "I need to know. Not for Mark. For the 47 people still employed there who are updating their resumes every night and checking their bank accounts with growing panic. For clients who've been with us for years who deserve a managed transition rather than a sudden collapse." His genuine concern for his colleagues was unexpected but not implausible. Greg had always been ambitious but never callous. I considered my response carefully, weighing confidentiality against the potential value of having an informed ally within RMG. "We're exploring options," I admitted finally. "Nothing has been decided." Relief flickered across his face. "Then I have information you need to consider before making any decisions." He reached into his messenger bag and extracted a folder, sliding it across the table. "Mark doesn't know I compiled this. It's a complete assessment of Reynolds' current financial position, client contract statuses, and outstanding obligations. The real numbers, not the ones being presented to the board." I didn't immediately reach for the folder. "Why are you doing this, Greg? This could be considered a significant breach of confidentiality." He met my gaze steadily. "Because I've watched Mark Reynolds dismantle everything good about that company through ego, short-sightedness, and willful disregard for the people who built it. Because I've spent 2 years trying to do your job without your experience or authority, being blamed for failures that resulted from decisions I wasn't allowed to question. And because—" He hesitated, then continued with renewed determination. "Because what happened to you was wrong. And this feels like the closest thing to justice that's likely to occur." I considered him thoughtfully. "You could be positioning yourself for a role at Clearview after an acquisition." He nodded, not denying it. "I won't pretend personal survival isn't a factor. But if that were my only motivation, there are less risky approaches than corporate espionage." A ghost of his former confidence surfaced in a wan smile. "I'm good at what I do, Sarah. Not as good as you are, but I've learned a lot cleaning up messes these past 2 years. I believe I could be valuable to Clearview, acquisition or not, but that's not why I'm here today." I finally reached for the folder, opening it to scan the first few pages. The level of detail was impressive and potentially invaluable for acquisition planning. This wasn't a hastily assembled collection of obvious information, but a methodically constructed analysis that must have taken weeks to compile. "This is comprehensive," I acknowledged, closing the folder. "But I need to be clear. I can't make any promises about your future employment, regardless of how helpful this information proves to be." "I understand," he said quickly. "I'm not asking for guarantees, just consideration. That I can offer." I placed the folder in my bag. "Is there anything else I should know that isn't documented here?" Greg hesitated, then lowered his voice further. Mark knows something's happening. He doesn't have specifics, but he's paranoid about Clearview's recent hires from RMG. He's been having me research your company's financial position, client acquisitions, anything that might indicate your future strategy. This was concerning, but not entirely surprising. Of course, Mark would be monitoring potential threats, and Clearview's growth trajectory made us an obvious subject of interest. Has he mentioned me specifically? I asked, keeping my tone casual. Greg's expression shifted subtly. He mentions you more than you might expect. Sometimes in anger, sometimes— He seemed to search for the right words. Sometimes with something that almost sounds like regret. After particularly difficult board meetings, he's been known to say things like, "Sarah would have known how to handle this," or "This wouldn't have happened if Sarah were still here." The revelation struck an unexpected chord. The idea that Mark might acknowledge, even privately, that my departure had negatively impacted RMG was both validating and oddly unsettling. It complicated the neat narrative I'd constructed, where he was simply the heartless villain who had discarded me without a second thought. "Interesting," I said, revealing nothing of my internal reaction. "And what about the board? How are they responding to the company's situation?" "They're divided," Greg explained. "The old guard, Mark's golf buddies and business school connections, are still backing him, accepting his explanations about market conditions and temporary setbacks. The newer members, the ones with actual industry experience, are pushing for accountability. There's talk of a vote on his leadership at the next quarterly meeting, but it's unclear if there's enough support to force a change." This information aligned with Patricia's assessment but added valuable context about the board dynamics. If an acquisition became reality, understanding these factions could be crucial for navigating the transition. We spoke for another 30 minutes, Greg providing insights into specific client relationships, team dynamics, and operational challenges that wouldn't appear in any financial documentation. By the time we finished, I had a much clearer picture of RMG's current state, and it was even more precarious than I had initially believed. As Greg prepared to leave, he paused, seeming to wrestle with whether to say something more. Finally, he spoke. "There's one other thing you should know. The day after you were let go, I found Mark in his office, staring at nothing. When I asked if he needed anything, do you know what he said? I've made a terrible mistake. I didn't understand." What he meant then, I do now. With that, he left, disappearing into the morning crowd outside the cafe. I remained at the table, turning over his parting revelation. If true, it suggested Mark had experienced doubt about his decision almost immediately, yet he had never reached out, never attempted to rectify what he'd done, not even when my cancer became public knowledge through industry channels. Regret without action was meaningless. And yet, this glimpse of Mark's private sentiment complicated my emotional landscape as I prepared to potentially dismantle the company he had spent decades building. My phone buzzed with a text from Michael. "Investment committee meeting moved. Up. They want to discuss RMG proposal tomorrow, 10 a.m. Events were accelerating beyond my anticipated timeline. I gathered my things, leaving a generous tip for the barista, and stepped out into Seattle's characteristic light rain. As I walked back to my office, I found myself contemplating not just the business logistics of an acquisition, but the human cost of Mark Reynolds' leadership failures, and the complex responsibility I would bear if Clearview absorbed what remained of the company that had once discarded me. The folder Greg had provided sat heavy in my bag, both physically and metaphorically. Its contents would likely prove decisive in the coming negotiations, information obtained through morally ambiguous means for what I believed to be justifiable ends. The path forward was becoming clearer, though not necessarily simpler. If we moved to acquire Reynolds Media Group, I would need to navigate not just the financial and operational complexities, but the personal history that made this particular business transaction unlike any other. The investment committee meeting unfolded exactly as I had anticipated, initial skepticism giving way to calculated interest as the financial models demonstrated the potential value of acquiring Reynolds Media Group at its current depressed valuation. Greg's documentation, carefully sanitized to protect its source, provided crucial insights that strengthened our negotiating position and identified specific assets worth targeting. The client contracts alone represent significant value, observed Diane Kaplan, the most conservative member of Michael's investment team. Even accounting for attrition during transition, the projected revenue stream justifies nearly 60% of the acquisition cost. And their creative portfolio licenses have substantial unexploited potential, added Jonathan, our financial director. Many of their campaigns could be adapted for new markets with minimal additional investment. Throughout the discussion, I maintained professional focus, addressing questions about integration challenges, potential regulatory concerns, and staff retention strategies. Only Michael, who knew my history with RMG better than anyone in the room, occasionally shot me questioning glances when the conversation turned to how current leadership would be handled post-acquisition. Our models assume complete restructuring of executive operations, I explained when asked directly. While we would retain key creative and account management personnel, the existing leadership architecture would be replaced by Clearview's more efficient structure. And Reynolds himself, asked Diane, always direct. He founded the company, maintains significant ownership stake, and has deep industry connections despite recent setbacks. How do you envision handling that relationship? Fair question, and one I had prepared for extensively. Mark Reynolds would be offered a transitional consulting role with clearly defined parameters, I said, my voice betraying none of the complex emotions beneath this clinical statement. His institutional knowledge has value, but operational. Control would transfer immediately to our management team. When the meeting concluded 3 hours later, the decision was unanimous. Michael's firm would back Clearview's acquisition bid for Reynolds Media Group, providing the necessary capital, supplementation to my own investment. The wheels were set in motion with remarkable speed, legal teams engaged, preliminary valuation assessments commissioned, confidential approaches made to key RMG board members identified through Patricia and Greg's intelligence as potentially supportive of a change in control. 10 days later, I received the call that would set the final confrontation in motion. Michael's voice carried barely contained excitement. The RMG board has agreed to hear our proposal. They've scheduled a special session for next Thursday. That's faster than expected, I noted, rearranging my mental timeline. Who made the contact? Lawrence Chen, their newest board member. Apparently, there was an emergency financial review that didn't go well for current management. They're more receptive than we anticipated. Will Mark be present for the presentation? The question had been circling my thoughts since we'd begun this process. Yes, Michael confirmed. Chen was explicit about that. He wants Reynolds to hear the proposal directly, no filters. A meeting that would bring me face-to-face with Mark Reynolds for the first time since he had terminated my employment during my cancer diagnosis. The symmetry was almost too perfect, like something from a screenplay rather than real corporate maneuvering. Yet here we were, the confrontation I had never sought but now embraced approaching with inexorable certainty. I'll be ready, I assured Michael, already mentally rehearsing the presentation that would need to be flawlessly professional despite the personal undercurrents. The week before the board meeting passed in a blur of preparation. Our legal team finalized the acquisition proposal, identifying specific terms that would be non-negotiable versus areas where we had flexibility. The financial models were stress-tested against multiple scenarios. I worked with our HR director to develop retention packages for key RMG staff we hoped to keep through the transition. Through it all, I maintained outward composure while processing the complex emotions this situation evoked. This wasn't just another business acquisition. It was the culmination of a journey that had begun in the lowest moment of my life. The symmetry was undeniable, from being dismissed from Reynolds Media Group during my greatest vulnerability to potentially becoming its owner. The narrative arc was almost too perfect, too much like poetic justice to seem real. The morning of the presentation, I stood before my closet considering my appearance with unusual attention to detail. This wasn't vanity, but strategy. Every element of my presence in that boardroom would communicate messages beyond my words. I selected a tailored charcoal suit, powerful without being aggressive, professional without being severe. My hair now, fully regrown after chemotherapy though in a different texture than before, was styled in a simple, sophisticated cut that framed my face. The mirror reflected a woman who had not just survived but transformed, stronger, more assured, no longer seeking validation from those who had once undervalued her. Nathan found me in my office reviewing the presentation one final time. "The car's ready whenever you are," he said, then hesitated. "Are you sure you don't want me to come with you?" "Moral support?" I smiled, appreciating his concern. "This is something I need to do myself." He nodded, understanding. "For what it's worth, everyone here is incredibly proud of what you've built. Not just the business success, but the kind of company Clearview has become under your leadership." His words touched me more deeply than expected. "Thank you. That means a great deal." The drive to Reynolds Media Group's headquarters was a journey through memory as much as physical space. I passed buildings where I had attended client meetings, restaurants where I had celebrated campaign launches, parks, where I had sometimes taken lunch breaks on particularly beautiful Seattle days. For 12 years, this city had been the backdrop to my professional life at RMG. Each location layered with associations now viewed through the lens of everything that had happened since. When the car pulled up to the familiar glass tower housing, RMG's offices, I felt a momentary disorientation, the strange doubling of returning to a place that had once been central to your life but now exists only in memory. The security guard at the desk recognized me, surprise registering briefly before professional demeanor reasserted itself. "Ms. Harper?" He nodded, checking his visitor list. "They're expecting you in the executive boardroom, 15th floor." "Thank you, Joe," I replied, remembering his name from countless mornings passing through this lobby. "Still working the day shift after all these years?" He seemed pleased at being remembered. "Yes, ma'am. Some things don't change around here, though plenty else has." The elevator ride to the 15th floor gave me a final moment of solitude to center myself. When the doors opened, I stepped out into the reception area where I had once belonged, without question. Now I was an outsider, albeit one about to propose a takeover that would fundamentally reshape this entire operation. Greg was waiting by the reception desk, his expression a carefully maintained professional mask, though his eyes conveyed recognition of the moment's significance. "Ms. Harper," he greeted me formally for the benefit of nearby staff. "The board is assembled and ready for your presentation." "Thank you, Mr. Harmon," I replied with equal formality, following him down the hallway toward the boardroom. Outside, the heavy wooden doors, he paused. "Everyone's in there," he said quietly. Mark arrived early, which is unusual for him lately. He knows something significant is happening, though I don't think he's connected all the dots yet. I nodded, appreciating the intelligence. "Understood." Greg hesitated, then added, "Good luck in there. Whatever happens." He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. We both understood the weight of what was about to unfold. Taking a deep, centering breath, I squared my shoulders and nodded to Greg to open the doors. The boardroom beyond was exactly as I remembered it. Expansive glass windows showcasing Seattle's skyline, the long polished table surrounded by high-backed leather chairs, the subtle lighting designed to flatter everyone present. 10 board members were seated along both sides of the table, with Lawrence Chen at the head position typically reserved for the chairperson, a telling detail about shifting power dynamics within RMG's governance. And there, at the far end of the table, was Mark Reynolds. He had aged in the 3 years since I'd last seen him, more gray at his temples, deeper lines around his eyes, a heaviness to his posture that hadn't been there before. When our eyes met across the boardroom, I watched recognition dawn, followed by confusion, then something like dawning comprehension as he connected my presence to the mysterious acquisition proposal his board had agreed to hear. "Ms. Harper." Lawrence Chen rose to greet me, extending his hand. "Thank you for joining us today. The board is looking forward to hearing your proposal." "Thank you for the opportunity, Mr. Chen," I replied, shaking his hand firmly. My gaze swept the room, acknowledging each board member with a respectful nod before finally returning to Mark. "Mr. Reynolds." He had recovered his composure somewhat, though the tightness around his eyes betrayed his discomfort. "Sarah," he said, managing what appeared to be an attempt at a cordial smile. "This is unexpected. Life often takes unexpected turns," I replied evenly, setting up my presentation materials at the podium. "As I believe we both know." The next 90 minutes unfolded with professional precision as I presented Clearview Digital's proposal to acquire Reynolds Media Group. I detailed the financial terms, the strategic rationale, the integration plan for clients and staff, and the vision for the combined entity moving forward. Throughout, I maintained perfect composure, addressing questions with confident expertise, neither avoiding Mark's occasional interjections nor engaging with the emotional subtext that hung palpably in the air between us. When I concluded the formal presentation, Lawrence Chen leaned forward. "This is certainly a comprehensive proposal, Ms. Harper. The terms appear fair given current market conditions, and your integration plan addresses many of our concerns about client and staff retention." Several board members nodded in agreement. I could see from their expressions that the business case was compelling, exactly as we had designed it to be. Only Mark remained stone-faced, his expression unreadable though his knuckles had whitened where he gripped his pen. "If I may," he finally spoke, his voice controlled despite the tension visible in his posture, "I'd like to request a brief private conversation with Ms. Harper before the board continues its deliberations." Lawrence Chen glanced at me questioningly. I nodded my assent. "We'll take a 30-minute recess," Chen announced. "Ms. Harper, you can use the small conference room across the hall for your discussion." As the board members filed out, murmuring among themselves about aspects of the proposal, Mark and I remained seated, measuring each other across the now empty boardroom. When the door closed behind the last board member, he finally spoke. "So, this is your play," he said quietly. "Buying the company that fired you. I have to admit, I didn't see this coming." "This isn't about revenge, Mark," I replied evenly. "It's a sound business decision. RMG has valuable assets that are being underutilized. Clearview has the leadership and vision to maximize that potential. The fact that our history adds a certain narrative symmetry is secondary." He studied me for a long moment. "You've changed. Cancer tends to do that," I said simply. "As does being discarded by a company you helped build." Mark flinched slightly at my directness. "I made a mistake," he admitted, the words clearly difficult for him. "I've had plenty of time to recognize that. The company has never been the same since you left." "No, it hasn't," I agreed. "But that's not why I'm here today. I'm here because Clearview sees potential value in what remains of RMG, and we're positioned to realize that value in ways your current leadership cannot." He stood abruptly, pacing to the window that overlooked the city. "Do you know what it's like?" he asked without turning. "To watch something you've built over decades begin to crumble, to recognize your own mistakes too late to correct them." Detached. Vulnerability in his question was unexpected. For a moment, I glimpsed the weight he carried. Not just RMG's business failures, but the recognition of his moral failure in how he had treated me. "I'm familiar with having things taken away," I replied, my voice softer, but no less resolute. With having to rebuild from nothing, Mark turned to face me. What happens to me in this acquisition scenario? Your presentation was deliberately vague on that point. You would be offered a transitional consulting role, I said. Your institutional knowledge has value, but operational control would transfer to Clearview's management team. In other words, I would report to you, he clarified, a hint of his former sharpness returning. Yes, I acknowledged simply. You would. Mark's expression cycled through emotions I had rarely seen him display during our years working together. Pride, anger, resignation, and finally something that might have been acceptance. He returned to the table, sitting heavily in his chair. There's a certain poetry to it, he admitted, his voice carrying a weariness I'd never heard before. You always were the most capable person in this company. I knew it even as I was letting you go. Then why did you do it? The question escaped before I could contain it. The one thing I had promised myself I wouldn't ask, wouldn't give him the satisfaction of knowing I still cared about his reasoning after all this time. Mark sighed, running. A hand through his hair, a gesture of genuine distress I had witnessed perhaps twice in all our years working together. The easy answer would be business expediency. We were at a critical juncture with Westfield. I couldn't see how we would manage without you physically present for 2 months. That was the reason you gave me, I noted. I'm asking for the real one. He met my gaze directly for the first time since I had entered the boardroom. Fear, he said simply. Not of the business failing, though that was part of it, but of watching you suffer. Of having to confront mortality in someone He hesitated. Someone I valued professionally. The admission was unexpected enough to momentarily disarm me. You fired me because you were uncomfortable with my cancer diagnosis? I fired you because I'm a coward, Mark replied with brutal honesty. Because serious illness reminds people like me of our own fragility. Because your situation demanded compassion and humanity I wasn't equipped to provide. He shook his head. I told myself it was a business decision. I convinced myself it was necessary. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I took the easy way out. His candor was disarming. In all the scenarios I had imagined for this confrontation, Mark's frank acknowledgement of his moral failure had never figured among them. I had expected defensiveness, perhaps anger, maybe even dismissal of the entire situation as ancient history, not this raw admission of weakness. The company started failing almost immediately after you left, he continued. Not just financially, though that became evident within quarters, but culturally. Your departure signaled something to everyone, though it took me too long to recognize it. When people realized how disposable even the most valuable team member could be, something fundamental broke in the organization's spirit. I absorbed his words without immediately responding. There was validation in his acknowledgement, certainly, but it came years too late to change what had happened. Recognition without action isn't particularly meaningful, Mark. I know, he admitted. I should have reached out when I heard you were in remission. I should have acknowledged my mistake, offered some kind of amends. He gestured around the boardroom. But by then, things were already spiraling. Each quarter brought new challenges I wasn't equipped to handle without you. Pride kept me from admitting I'd made a catastrophic error. To you, to the board, even to myself. I studied him. This man who had once held such power over my professional life, now seemingly diminished by his own choices. What do you want from this conversation, Mark? My forgiveness? Assurance that I won't dismantle everything you've built if the acquisition proceeds? I don't expect forgiveness, he replied quietly. I haven't earned it. What I want is... He paused, considering his words carefully. Professional recognition that not everything we built here was worthless. That despite my failures and the company's current state, the core of what Reynolds Media Group stood for might be worth preserving in some form. It was a surprisingly humble request from a man whose arrogance had once seemed his defining characteristic. I considered his words, separating my personal history with Mark from the legitimate business considerations at hand. The acquisition proposal already accounts for preserving RMG's valuable elements, I said finally. The creative legacy, the client relationships worth maintaining, the staff who contribute genuine value. What we would discard are the dysfunctional management structures and outdated approaches that have driven the company to its current position. And me? Mark asked directly. You mentioned a transitional consulting role. Is that genuine or simply a face-saving measure before I'm eventually phased out completely? That depends entirely on you, I replied with equal directness. If you can adapt to a new reality, accept changed power dynamics, and contribute value without undermining new leadership, there could be a place for your experience. If not, I let the alternative hang unspoken between us. Mark nodded slowly, accepting the implicit challenge. 3 years ago, I would have rejected this entire scenario outright. The idea of Reynolds Media Group under anyone's control but mine would have been unthinkable. He gave a short, humorless laugh. Amazing how consecutive quarters of declining performance can adjust one's perspective. Humility often arrives through difficult circumstances, I observed, thinking of my own journey through cancer treatment and professional reinvention. Indeed. Mark straightened in his chair, some of his former business-like demeanor returning. The board is likely to approve your proposal. Lawrence Chen has been advocating for new leadership for months, and several others have lost confidence in my ability to turn things around. When this proceeds, what happens immediately? I appreciated his shift toward practical matters. A transition team would begin working with your key personnel immediately. Client retention would be our first priority, followed by staff assessment and integration planning. The public announcement would emphasize continuity for clients while highlighting the enhanced capabilities of the combined organization. And the Reynolds name? He asked, a final vestige of pride evident in his tone. I had considered this question extensively during our acquisition planning. The Reynolds Media Group name carried both value and baggage in the industry. Initially maintained for specific legacy accounts with strong attachment to the brand, but gradually transitioned to Clearview Digital for all operations over approximately 12 months. Mark absorbed this with a slight nod. Reasonable, he stood, signaling our private conversation was nearing its end. Before we rejoin the board, I want to say something that's long overdue. He met my gaze directly. I am sorry, Sarah. Not just for how I handled your illness, but for failing to recognize what I was throwing away, both professionally and personally. Whatever happens with this acquisition, I need you to know that. The apology caught me off guard. Throughout my cancer treatment, during the painful rebuilding of my career, even as I'd planned this acquisition, I had never actually expected to hear those words from Mark Reynolds. Now that they had been spoken, I found my carefully constructed, emotional defenses momentarily wavering. Thank you for saying that, I replied, my voice controlled despite the unexpected emotions his words had stirred. It doesn't change what happened, but I appreciate the acknowledgement. Mark nodded, accepting the limited reception of his apology. Shall we rejoin the board? I believe they've had sufficient time to discuss your proposal privately. We returned to the boardroom, where the board members had already reassembled. From their expressions, ranging from resignation to cautious optimism, I could tell that consensus was forming in favor of the acquisition. Lawrence Chen confirmed this impression when he called the meeting back to order. Ms. Harper, the board, has discussed your proposal and finds the terms generally acceptable, subject to standard due diligence and final negotiation of specific points. He glanced at Mark, who had retaken his seat at the far end of the table. Mr. Reynolds has indicated he's open to the transition structure outlined in your presentation. Do you have anything to add before we move to a preliminary vote? I stood, addressing the entire board with the confidence that came from knowing I was now negotiating from a position of strength rather than vulnerability. Only this: Clearview Digital's interest in Reynolds Media Group stems from recognition of the foundational strengths that exist here despite recent challenges. Our goal isn't to dismantle what you've built, but to revitalize it within a more sustainable structure. The clients you've served, the creative standards you've maintained at your best, these are worth preserving. What needs to change are the operational approaches and leadership philosophies that have proven ineffective in today's market environment. Several board members nodded in agreement. Even Mark remained composed, his expression suggesting something between resignation and relief. The preliminary vote was called, and the result was decisive: 8 in favor of proceeding with the acquisition. Process: 2 abstentions, 0 opposed. As the meeting concluded and hands were shaken across the boardroom, I found myself standing beside Mark as board members filtered out. For a moment, we observed each other in silence, former boss and employee, soon to exchange roles in a reversal neither of us could have imagined 3 years earlier. "What does it feel like?" he asked quietly, once we were effectively alone. "Coming back like this, poised to take control of what was once denied to you?" I considered his question seriously, looking past the easy answer of triumph or vindication to something more complex and truthful. "It feels like closing a circle," I said finally. "Not an ending so much as a completion. The company you built taught me much of what I know, both through your leadership successes and failures. Now those lessons will help shape whatever Reynolds Media Group becomes next." Mark nodded slowly, absorbing my words. "I suppose there are worse legacies." He extended his hand. "To completion, then." I accepted his handshake, this simple professional gesture somehow embodying the complex journey that had brought us to this moment. To completion. As I left the Reynolds Media Group offices that afternoon, I felt a profound sense of transition, not just for the 2 companies that would soon become one, but for myself personally. The acquisition would proceed, legal teams would handle the details, integration specialists would manage the complexities, and eventually Clearview Digital would absorb what remained of value in the company that had once discarded me. But the true resolution had already occurred in that boardroom, not through triumph over Mark Reynolds, but through the recognition that my path had never really been about him at all. It had been about finding my own strength, building something that reflected my values, and ultimately creating a company where what had happened to me would never happen to anyone else. The symmetry was perfect, but not in the way I had initially imagined. This wasn't a story of revenge, but of transformation, of taking the broken pieces of one life and building something stronger, more compassionate, and ultimately more successful than what had been lost. The acquisition process unfolded over the next 3 months with the methodical precision that had become Clearview's hallmark. Due diligence confirmed what our preliminary investigations had suggested. Beneath Reynolds Media Group's financial troubles lay salvageable assets, valuable client relationships, and talented staff who had persevered despite deteriorating conditions. The final purchase price, negotiated down by 12% from our initial offer based on discovered liabilities, represented just 35% of RMG's valuation from 3 years earlier. Throughout this period, I maintained a careful, professional distance from day-to-day negotiations, focusing instead on strategic planning for the integration phase. My leadership team handled most direct interactions with RMG staff, conducting assessment interviews, reviewing portfolios, and identifying which positions would transition to the combined organization. This approach wasn't about avoiding confrontation, but ensuring decisions were made on merit rather than personal history. Mark, to his credit, honored our agreement with surprising grace. He provided necessary information, facilitated access to critical documentation, and maintained a stabilizing presence with nervous clients during the transition period. Whether This cooperation stemmed from genuine acceptance of the new reality, or simply pragmatic recognition of inevitable change. It made the complex process significantly smoother than anticipated. One Tuesday afternoon, approximately 6 weeks into the acquisition process, I received an unexpected visitor at Clearview's offices. Eleanor, my former oncology nurse, stood in our reception area, looking somewhat out of place among the contemporary design elements and bustling creative professionals. "Eleanor?" I greeted her with genuine surprise and warmth. "What brings you here?" She smiled, the familiar kindness in her eyes unchanged from our many hours together during my treatment. "I hope you don't mind the unexpected visit. I was in the building for a medical conference and saw your company name in the directory." "Not at all," I assured her, leading her to my office. "It's wonderful to see you." Once we were seated with tea, she had remembered my post-chemotherapy aversion to coffee. Eleanor's expression grew more serious. "I follow business news more than you might expect. Oncology nurses develop rather diverse interests sitting with patients through all those treatment hours." She nodded toward a business magazine on my desk that featured an article about the pending acquisition. "Congratulations seem to be in order." "Thank you," I replied, unsure where this conversation was heading. Eleanor studied me with the perceptive gaze that had often seen through my carefully maintained composure during treatment. "When you were going through your worst days, remember that particularly difficult round in your second month? You told me something I've never forgotten." I remembered those dark days vividly, when the physical toll of treatment had been compounded by financial stress and the raw wound of professional betrayal. "What was that?" "You said that if you survived, you wanted to build something that would make your experience matter, that would give purpose to your suffering." Eleanor leaned forward slightly. "I've seen many patients make similar promises during treatment. Few have the opportunity or determination to fulfill them so completely." Her observation struck me with unexpected force. In the intensity of business negotiations and strategic planning, I had somewhat lost sight of the deeper meaning behind what I was building. "I've tried," I acknowledged quietly. "The acquisition has been covered extensively in the business press," Eleanor continued. "But what caught my attention was a smaller article about Clearview's employee benefits program, particularly your comprehensive medical leave policies and cancer care coverage. The journalist noted it was unusually robust for a company your size." I smiled faintly. "It was one of the first policies I implemented after founding Clearview. No employee of mine will ever face what I did." Eleanor nodded approvingly. "That's what I hoped to hear." She reached into her bag and extracted a folder. "The reason I'm really here, beyond wanting to see how you've transformed since those treatment days, is this." She handed me the folder, which contained information about a foundation connected to Seattle Memorial Hospital that provided support services for cancer patients facing employment challenges during treatment. "We're looking for business leaders to join our advisory board, people who understand both the corporate perspective and the patient experience. When I saw the news about your company's growth, I immediately thought of you. The invitation represented something I hadn't anticipated, a chance to address systemic issues beyond just my own company's policies, to potentially influence how businesses throughout Seattle approached employee illness." "I'd be honored," I said without hesitation. "This issue matters deeply to me." "I thought it might," Eleanor replied with satisfaction. "We meet monthly. The time commitment is reasonable, but the impact can be significant." After Eleanor left, I found myself reflecting on how completely my professional journey had circled back to its most painful inflection point. The acquisition of Reynolds Media Group represented business success, certainly, but this foundation work offered something different, a chance to transform my personal trauma into broader systemic. That evening, I shared this new development with Nathan over dinner at a quiet restaurant near our offices. "It feels right," I told him, like something's completing itself in ways I couldn't have anticipated. Nathan, who had been with me since Clearview's early days, nodded thoughtfully. The acquisition was always about more than business for you, wasn't it? Even if you wouldn't admit it explicitly. Perhaps, I acknowledged, though the business case was always sound. Of course, he agreed with a knowing smile. But sound business and personal meaning aren't mutually exclusive. The best leaders find ways to align them. The final phase of the acquisition arrived, faster than expected. 1 week before the official closing date, I scheduled the meeting I had been both anticipating and dreading. A private discussion with Mark Reynolds to finalize his role in the new organization structure. We met in neutral territory, a conference room at our lawyer's offices downtown, surrounded by the sterile professionalism of leather-bound law books and contemporary art selected for its inoffensiveness. Mark arrived precisely on time, dressed, in the impeccable suit and subtle power tie that had once been his daily uniform. The past 3 months had changed him visibly, not physically so much as in his demeanor. The defensive arrogance that had defined him throughout most of our professional relationship had given way to something more measured, more reflective. The paperwork is nearly complete, he said after preliminary greetings had been exchanged. Your team has been thorough. They're good at what they do, I replied, which brings us to the purpose of this meeting, defining what you'll do once the transition is official. Mark nodded, accepting the directness of my approach. I've given this considerable thought. Your offer of a consulting position is generous, but I've come to a different conclusion about my path forward. This was unexpected. Throughout the acquisition process, he had given every indication of accepting the transitional role we had proposed. I'm listening. I'm going to decline any position within the combined organization, he said, his tone decisive but not confrontational. Not out of pride or inability to accept the new power structure, but because I believe my presence would inevitably complicate the integration process. There would always be RMG employees looking to me instead of embracing new leadership. Always. The shadow of our history influencing decisions that should be made on their merits alone. His self-awareness surprised me. This level of organizational consciousness had rarely been evident during our years working together. That's remarkably insightful. A faint smile touched his lips. Perhaps losing everything offers clarity, unavailable from other vantage points. You haven't lost everything, I pointed out. The acquisition terms provide substantial compensation for your ownership stake. Money isn't everything, he replied. The irony of this statement from a man who had once measured all success in financial terms, not lost on either of us. But it does offer the freedom to consider what comes next. And what does come next for Mark Reynolds? I asked, genuinely curious about how he envisioned his future. He leaned back in his chair, a contemplative expression replacing his usual calculated business demeanor. I've accepted a visiting professor position at the business school. Starting next semester, I'll be teaching courses on entrepreneurship and organizational development. He smiled at my evident surprise. I know, not what anyone would have predicted. It's unexpected, I acknowledged, but potentially valuable. You've built a company from the ground up, sustained it for decades, and experienced both remarkable success and significant failure. That's a comprehensive education to share with students. My thinking exactly. He hesitated, then added, I'm also developing a course component specifically addressing leadership during employee health crises. It seems there's a significant gap in how business schools prepare future executives for these situations. The revelation struck me deeply. Mark wasn't just acknowledging his past mistake. He was actively working to prevent others from repeating it. That's commendable. It's necessary, he corrected gently. What happened between us was a failure on multiple levels, but perhaps most fundamentally an educational failure. I had never been taught to see employee wellness as anything other than a human resources issue. never been encouraged to develop compassion as a leadership skill along with strategic thinking and financial acumen. His words resonated with my own recent thoughts following Eleanor's visit. I've just joined the advisory board of a foundation working on exactly these issues from the patient advocacy side, I told him, supporting employees facing serious illness, creating best practices for companies to follow. Mark nodded, a look of genuine interest crossing his features. Perhaps there might be opportunities for collaboration there. Not immediately. I recognize the complex history that would make that challenging. But eventually, different perspectives approaching the same problem. The suggestion was so unexpected that I found myself momentarily speechless. The idea of potentially working alongside Mark in any capacity, even one focused on addressing the very injustice that had once divided us, seemed impossibly ironic. Yet there was also an undeniable symmetry to it, a completion of the circle that had brought us to this moment. Perhaps, I conceded, neither committing to nor dismissing the possibility. Time will tell. As our meeting concluded and we prepared to go our separate ways, likely for an extended period, given his decision to step away completely from the integrated company, Mark paused at the door. For what it's worth, he said quietly, watching you rebuild from what I destroyed, seeing the company you've created and the leader you've become, it's been humbling and educational in equal measure. Whatever else happens, I want you to know that. I considered his words, searching for any hint of manipulation or insincerity, and finding none. Thank you for saying that. He nodded once, accepting the limited response, then extended his hand. Good luck with the integration. Create something better than what either of us built separately. I accepted his handshake, this final professional gesture between us carrying the weight of our complex shared history. That's the plan. The official closing of the acquisition took place 3 days later, a simple matter of signatures and wire transfers despite the months of complex negotiation that had preceded it. Mark was notably absent, having already said his goodbyes to the company he had founded decades earlier. In his place, Reynolds Media Group was represented by its board chairman and chief financial officer, both of whom would be departing after a brief transition period. The following Monday morning, I stood before the combined staff of Clearview, Digital and the former Reynolds Media Group in the large event space we had rented specifically for this occasion. Nearly 200 people filled the room. Creative professionals, account managers, strategists, and support staff from both organizations, their expressions ranging from excitement to apprehension as they contemplated their shared future. As I looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar from my Clearview team, others known from my past at Reynolds, and many entirely new, the magnitude of what we had accomplished finally settled into reality. This moment represented not just a business transaction, but a profound personal journey from devastation to rebuilding, to something I could never have imagined during those dark days of treatment. Today marks not just the beginning of a new chapter. For our combined organization, I began, my voice carrying clearly through the silent room, but the creation of an entirely new story, one that honors the best elements of both our histories while charting a course defined by our shared values and vision. I proceeded to outline the practical aspects of the integration, organizational structure, timeline for systems integration, client transition plans, before arriving at what I considered the heart of my message. When I founded Clearview Digital, after my cancer treatment, I made a promise to myself that I would build a company where success and humanity weren't competing values, but complementary strengths. Where we would measure our achievements not just in revenue and market share, but in how we supported each other through life's inevitable challenges. My gaze swept across the room, meeting the eyes of former Reynolds employees who knew exactly what had prompted my departure from their company. Some of you know my personal history. Others are hearing it for the first time. I was once fired, while facing a cancer diagnosis because my illness was deemed incompatible with business needs. I paused, letting this sink in. That experience taught me that companies are ultimately defined not by their success in easy times, but by their character during difficult ones. From the back of the room, I spotted Patricia from finance, Greg from operations, and other familiar faces from Reynolds, who had provided crucial information during our acquisition process. Their expressions reflected vindication and hope, emotions I recognized intimately from my own journey. The company we're building together starts with this fundamental principle: we succeed together or not at all. Your health, your well-being, your humanity matter here, not despite our business goals, but as an essential foundation for achieving them. I gestured toward Nathan and my core leadership team standing at the side of the stage. In the coming weeks, you'll meet with department leaders to discuss your specific roles moving forward. I want to address the question I know many of you have. There will be no mass layoffs as part of this integration. We acquired Reynolds Media Group because we value its people and their talents. The relief in the room was palpable, releasing tension that had built over months of uncertainty. That said, this will be a period of significant change. Our workflows, reporting structures, and operational approaches will evolve as we combine the best elements of both organizations. I ask for your patience and active participation in this process. As I concluded my formal remarks and opened the floor for questions, a hand rose from the middle of the audience. It belonged to Madeline Chen, a senior creative director from Reynolds who had been with the company nearly as long as I had. "You could have dismantled Reynolds completely after what happened to you," she said when I called on her. "Many of us expected you would. Why didn't you?" The directness of her question created a hushed anticipation throughout the room. I considered my response carefully, wanting to be both honest and constructive as we began this new chapter. "Revenge might have provided momentary satisfaction," I acknowledged, "but it wouldn't have built anything lasting. What happened to me was wrong, but it also became the catalyst for creating something better. Clearview exists because Reynolds failed me when I needed support most. Now we have the opportunity to transform that failure into a foundation for something stronger than either company could have become separately." 6 months later, the integration was largely complete. The combined organization, now operating fully under the Clearview digital name, had retained 94% of clients from both original companies and achieved operational efficiencies that exceeded our initial projections. We had moved into expanded offices that physically represented our new beginning, open, collaborative spaces designed around human needs rather than hierarchical structures. On the 1-year anniversary of the acquisition closing, I received an unexpected email from Mark Reynolds. Attached was a case study he had developed for his business school course, examining the ethical and strategic dimensions of how companies handle employee health crises. He had used his own failure with my situation as the central example, unflinchingly, documenting his mistakes while highlighting Clearview's contrasting approaches as a model for future business leaders. "With your permission," he wrote, "I'd like to share this with my students. Perhaps some good can come from my failures if they help the next generation of leaders make better choices." I wrote back a simple response: "Permission granted. The next generation deserves better than what came before." As I closed my laptop that evening and looked out over the Seattle skyline from my office window, I reflected on the strange, painful, yet ultimately transformative journey that had brought me here. Being fired during my greatest vulnerability had nearly destroyed me, but it had also forced me to rebuild, not just my career, but my understanding of what truly matters in business and in life. The company I had created from that painful beginning now employed over 200 people, all covered by comprehensive health benefits that specifically included extended paid medical leave and cancer care coverage. The foundation work I had begun with Eleanor was expanding into advocacy for legislative changes to protect employees facing serious illness. Success, I had learned, wasn't measured in acquisitions or revenue milestones, though Clearview had achieved both. It was measured in creating systems where people could thrive, where vulnerability wasn't punished but supported, where humanity and business success reinforced rather than opposed each other. That was the true victory, not buying the company that had once discarded me, but building something fundamentally better in its place.